Chapter 15. No sooner had the genie transformed itself into a pigeon and flown from his window than Nathaniel closed the fastener, drew the curtains, and sank down upon the floor. His face was corpse-white, and his body shook with exhaustion. For almost an hour he remained slumped against the wall, staring at nothing. He had done it. Yes, he had done it, all right. The demon was bested, was under his control again. He only had to work the binding spell on the tin, and Bartimaeus would be forced to serve him for as long as he desired. It was all going to be fine. He had nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. So he told himself, but his hands trembled in his lap, and his heart pounded painfully against his chest, and the confident assertions he tried to conjure fell from his mind. Angrily, he forced himself to breathe deeply, and clasped his hands together tightly to suppress the shaking. Of course, this fear was only natural. He had ducked the stimulating compass by a fraction of a second. It was the first time he had come near death. That sort of thing was bound to cause a reaction. In a few minutes he would be back to normal. He could work the spell, take the bus to the Thames. The genie knew his birth name. It knew his birth name. Bartimaeus of Uruk, Sakir al-Genie of Al-Arish. He had allowed it to uncover his name. Mrs. Underwood had spoken, and the genie had heard, and in that moment the cardinal rule had been broken. And now Nathaniel was compromised, perhaps forever. He felt the panic welling up in his throat, the force of it practically making him gag. For the first time he could remember, his eyes stung with tears. The cardinal rule. If you broke that, you gave yourself up for lost. Demons always found a way. Give them any power at all, and sooner or later, they would have you. Sometimes it took years, but they would, always. He remembered famous case studies from the books. Werner of Prague. He had allowed his birth name to be uncovered by a harmless imp in his employ. In due course, the imp had told a foliot, and the foliot had told a genie, and the genie had told an afrit. And 3 years later, when Werner had been crossing Wenceslas Square to buy a smoked sausage, a whirlwind had swept him into the air. For several hours, his howls from above had deafened the townspeople going about their business, until the disruption had finished, with pieces of the magician raining down upon all of the weathercocks and chimneys. And this fate was hardly the most horrible that had befallen careless magicians. There was Paolo of Turin, Septimus Manning, Johann Faust. A sob broke from Nathaniel's mouth, and the small, pathetic sound shocked him out of his despair and self-pity. Enough of this! He wasn't dead yet, and the demon was still under his command. Or it would be, once he had disposed of the tobacco tin properly. He would pull himself together. Nathaniel struggled to his feet, his limbs awash with weakness. With a great effort, he drove his fears to the back of his mind, and began his preparations. The pentacle was redrawn, the incense changed. New candles were lit. He stole down to his master's library and double-checked the incantations. Then he added more rosemary to the tobacco tin, placed it in the center of its circle, and began the spell of indefinite confinement. After 5 long minutes, his mouth was dry and his voice cracked, but a steel gray aura began to gleam across the surface of the tin. It flared and faded. Nathaniel uttered the name of Bartimaeus, added an astrological date on which the confinement would begin, and finished. The tin was as before. Nathaniel put it in the pocket of his jacket, snuffed out the candles, and drew the rug over the markings on the floor. Then he collapsed upon the bed. When Mrs. Underwood brought her husband his lunch an hour later, she confided in anxiety with him.
"I'm worried about the boy,"
she said.
"He's barely touched his sandwich. He's flopped himself down at the table, white as a sheet, like he's been up all night. Something scared him, or he's sickening or for something.
She paused.
Dear?
Mr. Underwood was inspecting the array of food upon his plate.
No mango chutney, Martha. You know I like it with my ham and salad.
We've run out, dear. So what do you think we should do?
Buy some more. That's obvious, isn't it? Heavens above, woman.
About the boy.
Oh, he's all right. The brat's just nervous about the naming, and about summoning his first impling. I remember how terrified I got. My master practically had to whip me into the circle.
Mr. Underwood shoveled a forkful of ham into his mouth.
Tell him to meet me in the library in an hour and a half's time, and not to forget the almanac. No, make it an hour. I'll need to ring Duval about those thefts afterwards. Curse him.
In the kitchen, Nathaniel had still only managed half a sandwich. Mrs. Underwood ruffled his hair.
Back up,
She said.
Is it the naming that's unsettled you? You mustn't worry about it at all. Nathaniel's nice, but there are lots of other good names out there. Just think, you can choose whatever name you like, within reason. As long as no other current magician has it. Commoners don't have that privilege, you know. They have to stick with what they're given.
She bustled about, filling the teapot and finding the milk, and all the while talking. Nathaniel felt the tin weighing down his pocket.
I'd like to go out for a bit, Mrs. Underwood,
He said.
I need some fresh air.
She looked at him blankly.
But you can't, dear, can you? Not before your naming. Your master wants you in the library in an hour. And don't forget the normative almanac, he says. Though, having said that, you do look rather peaky. Fresh air would do you good, I suppose. I'm sure he won't notice if you nip out for 5 minutes. It's all right, Mrs. Underwood. I'll stay in.
5 minutes? He needed 2 hours, maybe more. He would have to dispose of the tin later and hope Bartimaeus didn't try anything beforehand. She poured a cup of tea and plunked it on the table before him.
That'll put some color in your cheeks. It's a big day for you, Nathaniel. When I see you again, you'll be someone else. This will probably be the last time I call you by your old name. I suppose I shall have to start forgetting it now.
Why couldn't you have started forgetting it this morning? He thought. A small malicious part of him wished to blame her for her careless affection. But he knew that this was totally unjust. It was his fault the demon had been on hand to hear her. Safe, secret, strong. He was none of these things now. He took a gulp of tea and burned his mouth.
Come in, boy, come in.
His master, seated in a tall upright chair beside the library desk, seemed almost genial. He eyed Nathaniel as he approached, and indicated a stool beside him.
Sit. Well, you're looking smarter than usual, even wearing a jacket, eh? I'm pleased to see that you register the importance of the occasion.
Yes, sir.
Right. Where's the almanac? Good. Let's have it.
The book was bound in shiny green leather with an ox hair ribbon bookmark. It had been delivered by Yaroslavs only the day before, and had not yet been read. Mr. Underwood opened the cover delicately and glanced at the title page.
Loew's Normative Almanac, 395th edition. How time flies. I chose my name from 350th, would you believe? I remember it as if it were yesterday.
Yes, sir.
Nathaniel stifled a yawn. His exertions of the morning were catching up with him, but he had to concentrate on the task in hand. He watched as his master flipped the pages, talking all the while.
The almanac, boy, lists all official names used by magicians between Prague's golden age and the present. Many have been used more than once. Beside each is a register that indicates whether the name is currently being occupied. If not, the name is free to be taken. or you can invent one of your own. See here. Underwood, Arthur, London. I am the second of that name, boy. The first was a prominent Jacobean, a close associate of King James I, I believe. Now, I have been giving the matter some consideration, and I think you would do well to follow in the footsteps of one of the great magicians.
Yes, sir.
I have thought Theophilus Throckmorton, perhaps. He was a notable alchemist, and yes, I see that combination is free. No, that doesn't appeal. What about Balthazar Jones? You're not convinced? Well, perhaps he is a hard act to follow. Yes, boy? You have a suggestion?
Is William Gladstone free, sir? I admire him.
Gladstone?
His master's eyes bulged.
The very idea. There are some names, boy, that are too great and too recent to touch. No one would dare. It would be the height of arrogance to assume his mantle.
The eyebrows bristled.
If you aren't capable of a sensible suggestion, I shall do the choosing for you.
Sorry, sir. I didn't think.
Ambition is all very well, my lad, but you must cloak it. If it is too obvious, you will find yourself brought down in flames before you reach your 20s. A magician must not draw attention to himself too soon, certainly not before he has summoned his first molar. Very well, we shall browse together from the beginning.
It took an hour and 25 minutes for the choice to be made, and a harrowing time Nathaniel had of it. His master seemed to have a great deal of affection for obscure magicians with obscurer names, and Fitzgibbon, Treacle, Holmes, and Gallimafree were avoided only with difficulty. Likewise, Nathaniel's preferences always seemed too arrogant or ostentatious to Mr. Underwood. Wearily, Mr. Underwood brought out the official form and entered in the new name and signed it. Nathaniel had to sign too, in a large box at the bottom of the page. His signature was spiky and ill-formed, but then it was the first time he had used it. He read it back to himself under his breath.
John Mandrake.
He was the third magician of that name. Neither of his predecessors had achieved much of significance, but by this time Nathaniel didn't care. Anything was better than treacle. It would do. His master folded the paper, placed it in a brown envelope, and sat back in his chair.
Well, John,
he said,
it is done. I shall get that stamped at the ministry directly, and you will then officially exist. However, don't go getting above yourself. You still know almost nothing, as you will see when you attempt to summon the Natterjack Impling tomorrow. Still, the first stage of your education is completed, thanks to me.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Heavens knows, it has been 6 long and tedious years. I often doubted you would get this far. Most masters would have turned you out onto the streets after that little affair last year. But I persevered. No matter. From now on, you may wear your lenses.
Thank you, sir.
Nathaniel couldn't help blinking. He was already wearing them. Mr. Underwood's voice took on a complacent tone.
All being well, in a few years we will have you in a worthy job, perhaps as an undersecretary in one of the lesser ministries. It won't be glamorous, but it will suit your modest capabilities perfectly. Not every magician can aspire to become an important minister like me, John, but that shouldn't stop you making a contribution of your own, however meager. In the meantime, as my apprentice, you will be able to assist me in trivial conjurations, and pay me back a little for all the effort I have spent on you.
It would be an honor, sir.
His master waved a hand of dismissal, allowing Nathaniel to turn away and assume a sour expression. He was halfway to the door when his master remembered something.
One more thing, he said. Your naming has happened just in time. In 3 days, I shall be attending Parliament to hear the state address given by the Prime Ministers to all senior members of his government. It is a largely ceremonial occasion, but he will be outlining his intended policies at home and abroad. Named apprentices are invited, too, along with spouses. Providing you do not displease me beforehand, I shall take you with me. It will be an eye-opening experience for you to see us master magicians all together.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. For the first time, almost in living memory when talking to his master, Nathaniel's enthusiasm was actually genuine. Parliament! The Prime Minister! He left the library and ran up the staircase to his room, and the skylight, through which the distant Houses of Parliament were barely visible beneath the grey November sky. To Nathaniel, the matchstick tower seemed bathed in sunshine. A little later, he remembered the tobacco tin in his pocket. There were still 2 hours till dinner. Mrs. Underwood was in the kitchen, while his master was on the telephone in his study. Stealthily, Nathaniel left the house by the front door, taking £5 from the tradesman's jar that Mrs. Underwood kept on a shelf in the hall. At the main road, he caught a bus heading south. Magicians were not known for catching public transport. He sat on the back seat as far away from the other passengers as possible, watching them get on and off out of the corner of his eye. Men, women, old, young, youths dressed in drab colors, girls with flashes of jewelry at their throats. They bickered, laughed, or sat quietly, read newspapers, books, and glossy magazines. Human, yes, but it was easy to see they had no power. To Nathaniel, whose experience of people was very limited, this made them, oddly, two-dimensional. Their conversations seemed about nothing. The books they read looked trivial. Aside from feeling that most of them were faintly vulgar, he could make nothing of them. After half an hour, the bus arrived at Blackfriars Bridge and the River Thames. Nathaniel alighted and walked to the very center of the bridge, where he leaned out over the wrought-iron balustrade. The river was at high tide. Its fast gray waters raced beneath him, its uneven surface swirling ceaselessly. Along both sides, blink-eyed office blocks clustered above the embankment roads, where car lights and street lamps were just beginning to come on. The Houses of Parliament, Nathaniel knew, stood just around a bend in the river. He had never been so close to them before. The very thought made his heart quicken. Time enough for that another day. First, he had a vital task to accomplish. From one pocket, he drew a plastic bag and a half-brick found in his master's garden. From another, he took the tobacco tin. Brick and tin went into the bag, the head of which was tied with a double knot. Nathaniel gave a quick glance both ways along the bridge. Other pedestrians hurried past him, heads down, shoulders hunched. No one glanced in his direction. Without any more ado, he tossed the package over the balustrade and watched it fall. Down, down. By the end, it was nothing but a white speck. He could barely see the splash. Gone. Sunk like a stone. Nathaniel pulled up the collar of his jacket, shielding his neck from the wind gusting along the river. He was safe. Well, safe as he could be for the moment. He had carried out his threat. If Bartimaeus dared betray him now. It began to rain as he made his way back along the bridge to the bus stop. He walked slowly, lost in thought, almost colliding with several hurrying commuters coming in the opposite direction. They cursed him as they passed, but he barely noticed. Safe. That was all that mattered. A great weariness descended upon him with every step.